Hi, everyone. I'm back again to cover the next presidential election in American history, which is the election of 1796. This is, or was, the third presidential election in American history, and it was the first time where the United States had two candidates for president as opposed to a candidate for president and multiple candidates for vice president. So there were two national tickets to choose from. And of course, according to the original constitutional provisions, whoever placed first in the electoral vote became president if that person got a majority, and whoever placed second became vice president. Because of some sort of underhanded things that took place during the election, a lot of presidential electors tried to vote strategically, which ended up meaning that John Adams, who was a Federalist, was elected president, and his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, who theoretically should have lost, became vice president because he got the second highest number of electoral votes. Just a few things about this election. This is the one that introduced the two-term tradition into American history that would be challenged here and there, but remain standard in the United States until 1940. Also, this election resulted in the first peaceful transfer of power in the United States, which was something that people in Europe didn't think would ever happen, that anybody who became president would ever voluntarily step down as president. But it happened this time. So that is an overview. I guess one other thing, too, is that Congress had actually changed hands during the midterm election of Washington's second term, and the Federalists regained control of Congress. So there was some precedent already established for a peaceful transfer of power. So let me switch this and we'll get into this really interesting election. One thing that's unusual, I guess, in a sense, especially when we look at early elections, is that a lot of things were happening for the first time that became kind of standard in American history. And one thing that happened, which I'll cover in the background, was George Washington was the first president to have a very difficult second term. His first term had a little turmoil, but nothing like the second term. And of course, Washington had not wanted to run for a second term, but did, and found it very difficult and just refused to run for a third term. So let's go over just a few things, because things that happened during Washington's second term promoted the polarization of America into two political parties, which has been mostly the pattern in the United States since that time. Early in Washington's second term, foreign affairs became a sticky subject for the Washington administration. And the point was that the U.S. had this treaty with France from 1778 saying that if either country got attacked, that the other one would come to its aid. Now, this alliance had some wording that seemed unimportant at the time, that gave George Washington enough wiggle room, because once England and France went to war, after France had started to execute the upper class, the aristocracy, France wanted the United States to enter in the war against England. George Washington knew how difficult it was the first time to win the American Revolution, and he felt that the United States was not at all prepared to stand up to England again, and he really did not want to get involved, which made Thomas Jefferson very unhappy, because Jefferson, as Secretary of State, did want the United States to step in on France's side. Anyway, early in Washington's second term, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, which stated the United States was not going to take sides, and it also said that the United States was going to have an embargo of shipping from the two countries for 2 months. This issue in the Proclamation of Neutrality was very controversial because Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans supported France and believed the United States was obligated to step in on France's behalf. And so Jefferson told Washington after this proclamation was issued that he was going to step down as Secretary of State by the end of the year. And he actually did step down early the next year. So George Washington was trying to figure out, okay, let's see if we can work something out with England. He sent Chief Justice John Jay to England. This is kind of interesting in a way because John Jay was Chief Justice of the United States, but the Supreme Court didn't have much to do. So Jay took this trip to England with a list of like grievances in the part of the United States government that they wanted to be addressed by England. And they weren't really sure like how this was going to go. Interestingly enough, the British were so excited to see John Jay arrive. This is exactly what they wanted because they did not want to get involved in another war on the North American continent. They were just too overextended as it was, and they were so excited about this. And so John Jay worked out this treaty, which was sort of kept secret. John Jay returned. They took it to the Senate, and it was discussed, but not released to the press at that time. Some of the things he was asked to do, he didn't do, and it led to some problems later. One of the things was Southern states wanted to be reimbursed for people who had been held in bondage that the British picked up, liberated, and then took back to England. So some Southern planters were really upset about this and wanted to be reimbursed. And John Jay actually was an early opponent of holding people in slavery. And that was not something that he put much effort towards, and so it did not make it into the bill, the proposed treaty. One of the other things that he did successfully was he convinced the British to move their troops off of U.S. territory. We don't often think about this, but after the Revolution, the British still had troops stationed at what would be Buffalo and Detroit today. And the British agreed to a timetable to move those troops out over time because they had to get word to them. It was going to take time. And the British wanted these troops at home anyway to fight France. So it was not a big, this was really what England wanted. They were so excited to accomplish these things. One thing interesting that happened was, even though the Supreme Court was not busy, John Jay did resign as Chief Justice to do this. And he happened to arrive in England right after England had won some important naval battles against the French. So that sort of paved the way for what John Jay was doing. Okay, so John Jay finished, signed the treaty, brought it back. He went to Congress, who had some issues with it. Thomas Jefferson, by this point, had left as Secretary of State. Edmund Randolph had taken his place. Randolph did not like the treaty, so he resigned. And the Democratic Republicans just reacted very, very negatively entirely out of proportion to the problem. And we're saying that George Washington wanted to be a dictator, and they were just overreacting, which created trouble because then Washington was seen as definitely a Federalist, not as a nonpartisan president with advisors from both sides. One of the things that ended up happening over all this, too, is that in 1795, the entire cabinet resigned. And so Washington had to replace everybody, which, again, was difficult. They were staggered throughout the year, but it still happened. The next item of interest, which was taking place sort of concurrently with all this, was the Whiskey Rebellion, which was an uprising in Pennsylvania by farmers who didn't like excise taxes on alcohol that had been passed by Congress, and they said they weren't going to pay these taxes. And Washington was really upset about this, that these are local people who are rebelling against the federal government, and people had just worked too hard to establish the federal government. First of all, these excise taxes were not that much, okay? And he took the army out to sort of put down this rebellion, which ended up being successful in the short run, but it also increased the number of opposition people who became the Democratic Republicans, or they joined the Democratic Republicans and assisted as the control of the U.S. House switched sides during the midterm election. The last thing I want to mention, which is very important, was a treaty that was called Pinckney's Treaty. I mean, it was officially the Treaty of San Lorenzo. The issue here was that Spain claimed the land, which is south of the Ohio River, but west of the mountains. And they were giving arms to the natives who lived there to keep people from the United States from moving there. That's what the big issue was. And another thing too was that Spain was making it tough for people from the United States to take goods down to sell in the markets in New Orleans. So George Washington sent Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina to go and meet with the Spanish to try to cobble together some kind of agreement that would address these things and get things moving in the right direction. Now, interestingly enough, Thomas Pinckney arrived just at the right time too, because Spain had just realized that its policy was not working and they were just giving weapons to the natives unnecessarily. And also, Spain had joined England in the war on France, and Spain, although England was doing well, Spain was not, and it was expensive to maintain this war with France. So Spain wanted an agreement also with the United States. I'm not going to go over all the provisions of the treaty, but one of them said that people from the United States could navigate the Mississippi River for 3 years with free access. Spain recognized the U.S. border claims and agreed to no longer help the natives. But this treaty was so incredibly popular. When it went to the U.S. Senate, it was approved unanimously. And Thomas Pinckney became a national hero for doing this. So now let's look at the preparations, the nominations for the presidential election of 1796. First, on the Federalist side, George Washington had zero interest in running again. A lot of people wanted him to run again for obvious reasons. He actually felt like he couldn't even win Virginia, and he just didn't want to. He wanted to go home. I mean, he was not doing well as far as his health anyway. So the question is, well, then who replaces him? And Federalists were kind of worried because no procedure existed to nominate candidates. The only national figure the Federalists could run was John Adams, who was vice president. In April of 1795, so this was like a year and a half before the election, John Jay, who was another person who might have been elected or been a candidate for the Federalist Party, ran for governor of New York and won. He finally ended George Clinton's governorship. And in addition to winning, the Federalists took over full control of the New York legislature. Jay wanted to continue his term as governor of New York and not give up that office to run for president. The next year, John Marshall approached Patrick Henry, who had switched sides and had joined the Federalist, if he would be willing to run with John Adams. Henry was a little bit unsure about this because Thomas Jefferson, who was running on the other side, was also from Virginia, and obviously people from Virginia could not vote for Thomas Jefferson of the one party and Patrick Henry. So he, recognizing the I guess conflict there, decided he was not going to run. So 1796 was passing little by little and nothing was happening. Finally, in September of 1796, George Washington issued his farewell address. Hamilton and Jay wrote this, and this was a document that is quoted many, many times in American history. And the two things that are mentioned the most out of this address was that George Washington was against the emergence of political parties, and he tried to convince people that the United States should not get entangled in foreign alliances, particularly in Europe. He was not going to run again. Time was short. The Federalists had to do something. So Federalist leaders were going to go with John Adams, and they wrote to each other to try to figure out who's going to be his running mate. And they went with Thomas Pinckney, who had just signed this treaty with Spain. Now, Pinckney was still in Spain at the time. He did leave to come home in late 1796, and he actually arrived in Charleston right after the presidential electors voted that year. He didn't even know that he was the Federalist nominee for vice president. Very interesting. Let's go to the opposition. George Clinton wanted to run again. Now, he had been a candidate in 1789 and 1792, but the problem was when he was reelected governor in 1792, governor of New York, he actually lost that election, but he used the canvassing of the votes to throw out 3 counties that had voted for John Jay in that election so that Clinton could continue to serve as governor. And that was just super unpopular. People were just furious that he had essentially stolen the election. And Democratic Republican members of Congress just refused to deal with him. They weren't going to do it. Thomas Jefferson, everybody agreed, was going to be their presidential nominee. So who would be the vice presidential nominee, who would get that second electoral vote from each presidential elector? Well, members of the Democratic Republican members of Congress from Pennsylvania really liked Aaron Burr, who at that time was the senator from Virginia, from New York, not Virginia. And so Burr became the vice presidential nominee. Interestingly enough, though, people from Virginia didn't trust him either. So the Democratic Republicans there didn't really support him. One of the interesting things about the presidential election of 1796 is that very little was discussed about the vice presidential candidates. People were interested in people who were running for president, Adams and Jefferson, but hardly anything was mentioned about their running mates. So here's a map. This shows how people expected the election to be, what the outcome of the election. So the brown would be the Democratic Republicans, and the blue would be the Federalists. The white areas here are the areas that were up for grabs. This is where the campaign was really going to be. So what you can see there is the Federalists had sort of 66 guaranteed electoral votes. Democratic Republicans were way behind after losing New York State with only 32. And just looking at the map, it's pretty clear what they needed to do to catch up. First of all, they needed almost everything that was left in order to win. That meant, of course, just looking at the map here, Pennsylvania is the biggest set of electoral votes up for grabs. And so that's where a lot of the campaigning actually was centered at the time. The issues of 1796 were not as important as the rhetoric made them out to be. For example, the Democratic Republicans claimed to be in favor of as localized political power as possible, which is kind of funny because that was actually happening in New England. It was not happening in the South. In the South, the local unit of government was the county, not the township in the middle states or towns in New England. And the thing about having the local unit be in the county is that slave owners ran the counties. So it was not the yeoman farmers that Thomas Jefferson kept talking about who were making decisions. It was the slave owners, the plantation owners who were making decisions. Unlike in New England, where it was the yeoman farmers who were making the decisions. But the Federalists never were able to explain that, to get that out to people so they could understand. So the Thomas Jefferson and his supporters kept saying that, oh, John Adams is going to be like George Washington, a monarchist who is going to try to serve for life. Very interesting thing, considering the fact that Washington had stepped down. The Federalist, okay, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were very limited in what they did to win this race. Like John Adams did nothing at all, zero. Thomas Jefferson was a little bit more involved because he had been involved with newspaper editors to try to get his point across during the second Washington administration about what he disagreed with in national policy. So he was just a little bit involved. That is a distinction, though, that John Adams was just silent and let other people campaign. The term electioneering actually already existed at that time, and it was one of the things that John Adams complained about. He thought it was terrible. Somebody would go around asking people to vote for him. Okay. One of the interesting things that happened right before the election was this man, Pierre Adet, who was the ambassador from France, who supported Thomas Jefferson. He sent 4 articles to local newspapers in Pennsylvania that were trying to embarrass the Federalists, the Washington administration, and the Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, wrote some sort of rebuttals that some newspapers carried. But what was happening here is Federalists were saying, why are we letting France interfere in our presidential election? The position with France is another thing that's kind of strange. The Federalists tended to be more interested in England than in France, whereas the Democratic Republicans were more interested in France. Now, this is interesting too, because although both England and France had a big disparity between the super wealthy aristocracy and everybody else, it was less pronounced in England. Plus, in England, they allowed people to enter in sort of a middle class like life, which was just really not possible in France. So it's sort of like saying, well, it's like what was happening in the South, where you have these super wealthy plantation owners and everybody, the white people who did not own plantations, who were very poor, a lot of them were excluded from being able to vote. So it's sort of interesting that France was more popular than England in that regard, because most people would really prefer to be able to rise in life and not be stuck at the bottom all the time. Anyway, whatever. One of the things that happened towards the end of the election year was that Aaron Burr actually traveled throughout New England, and he met with people to try to encourage them to vote for him. And he met with Samuel Adams of Massachusetts in particular. He was gone for 2 months on this trip, which is sort of very unusual. I mean, this was not happening much in American history for a candidate to be traveling and campaigning, although it was understated from what we would think of as a campaign. But it was happening. Okay, so let's look at what happened here. The election was held over the course of, what would that be, 9 days, I guess. Again, here we have states in green elected presidential electors statewide. So you would go in and you would vote for multiple people, whatever your state was allotted. The states shown here in the purple color are the states that elected by district. So you would go in and you would say, for example, I want to vote for the Federalist candidate or the Democratic Republican candidate. For presidential elector, remember, they're not going in there and saying, I want to vote for John Adams. And then the sort of orange states here were choosing presidential electors by the state legislature. So one of the things you can see here, we've started to develop this, the range of voting. Now, what I'm getting ready to say was not a super big problem in 1796. Some states vote early, and as that information travels throughout the country in later presidential elections, that influences the states who, for example, in this, if that had happened in 1796, that might have tipped the scales in Maryland. This starts to become a problem over time as newspapers are better able to get information that they can publish to influence the election. Okay, so here we have the popular vote, and as you can see, it was sort of close. The number of people who showed up to vote for presidential electors for John Adams was a little higher, 35.7 thousand to 31.1 for Jefferson. But look at that middle column. Those people, the people who voted, actually picked more Democratic Republicans to elect presidential electors. Now, one of the issues here was Pennsylvania, which was incredibly tight and really, really close. And several of the counties never reported. Several were reporting late. The governor of Pennsylvania sent letters to him saying, hey, we need your vote. We have to find out who won this race. So eventually, on a certain day, he said, we have to go with what we have. And because people were voting for individuals, not for Adams or Jefferson, they were voting for people to cast the electoral vote. presidential electors who wanted to vote for Thomas Jefferson won all of the slots except for two. Those two were the people elected presidential electors who wanted to vote for John Adams. This is sort of confusing, and it makes sort of tabulation of the popular vote a little sticky. But nevertheless, that was the system. So then on the far right, you can see the states where electors were appointed by the legislature were overwhelmingly Federalist. And you can just add that up and see that John Adams was going to win this race. Now, we see that because we know what happened, but at the time, this was really in flux, depending on which counties had reported in Pennsylvania as to whether Adams had more or fewer presidential electors that he could count on in Pennsylvania. Elections for the U.S. House were taking place simultaneously. Not all states elected the members of Congress in even-numbered years at that time. As you can see, the states in green voted in 1796 for the Congress of 1797 to 1799. And one thing is sort of interesting about this is the Federalists gained 3 seats. And remember, they were in the minority in the U.S. House. So if no other seats changed hands of the white states here, the Federalists had trimmed the lead, their deficit, down to just 2. So obviously, if the Federalists were able to carry the presidential election, that might influence how the states shown here in white might vote for the U.S. House. Now, presidential electors had been elected. They had been certified. Somebody had been assigned to go let people know in each state who had won, tell them come to the state capitol on the designated day to come vote. And one thing that happened during the interim before the presidential electors voted was Alexander Hamilton waded into the election again, and he tried to game the system. And what he tried to do was he sent people to states in New England saying, you know what, this is going to be pretty close. What if we withhold some votes from Thomas Pinckney to make sure that John Adams places first? Meanwhile, he sent other people to the South saying, why don't we withhold some votes from John Adams to make sure that Thomas Pinckney places first? The reason he was doing this is he wanted Thomas Pinckney to be elected president. Well, this guy, Elbridge Gerry, who is shown here, that eventually the gerrymander would be named for, heard about this, and he went over and told John Adams about it, which really infuriated John Adams because Adams and Hamilton sort of got along up to that point, but their relationship was just really undermined by this. So, especially given once Pennsylvania's electors were certified and people realized how close it was, the fact that Alexander Hamilton was playing this game was just incredibly dangerous for the Federalists. Okay, presidential electors met in the states December 7, 1796 to cast the electoral vote. Now, this is a map which shows how presidential electors cast what we call today their first vote. This is the Adams versus Jefferson vote. Some interesting things you'll notice here. First of all, the brown square in Maryland that's out in the Atlantic Ocean, if I could get the right body of water out. One of the presidential electors in Maryland voted for John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. He voted for the people who ran against each other, which is the only time that's ever happened. There was a tweak in 1808 that sort of falls along those lines, but anyway. That makes it a little bit sticky because that means we have more first votes than the number that actually existed, which is really confusing. And so on the next slide where I show the second votes, the votes for vice president, you'll see that Maryland has a gap there because that one presidential elector cast 2 first votes. The man here on the left is Samuel Miles. He had been elected to cast an electoral vote for John Adams in Pennsylvania. He actually had a strange story because he ran as a Democratic Republican for the U.S. House in the midterms and lost. For some reason, he got nominated by the Federalists to run as presidential elector, and he won. But he really thought that Thomas Jefferson carried Pennsylvania, which was unsure of even at this time because some counties never reported. And so he voted for Thomas Jefferson. That stole an electoral vote that was supposed to go to John Adams. So John Adams wins 71 to 68. And this means Adams has been elected president. I'm going to go to the second vote shortly, but Thomas Pinckney was supposed to also get 71 electoral votes and become vice president. That didn't happen. He got fewer because of Alexander Hamilton's scheme, as I'm getting ready to show you. So Thomas Jefferson became vice president. So let's look at what happened with the second vote. And this is a little bit confusing if you don't know how this sort of worked. But the 2 candidates for vice president had a lot of opposition internally. So when we look there at New England, you can see Thomas Pinckney won like the darker blue colored electoral votes, which ran up and down throughout the country. He got all of his home state in South Carolina, all of Delaware, New Jersey, New York, and Vermont. He got most of Massachusetts and half of Connecticut. His stated opponent, Aaron Burr, was almost completely abandoned in Virginia, which was the biggest state to vote for Thomas Jefferson. He got most of the votes in Pennsylvania, and he got all the votes in Kentucky and Tennessee and half in North Carolina. Samuel Adams got the sort of pink part of Virginia there, which was the majority. And Oliver Ellsworth won the green states, the green electoral votes in New England, including all of Rhode Island and New Hampshire. They abandoned the Federalist Thomas Pinckney, the person they were supposed to vote for. Okay, so now you can see that a lot of scattering was happening here, 22 total. Federalist scattering are represented by the light blue, and other scattering is represented by the sort of yellow color. Now, this is kind of funny too. In North Carolina, those yellow votes there are people who voted for Thomas Jefferson for president and some Federalist for vice president, which we would think is kind of weird. One of them voted for, interestingly enough, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. Also, South Carolina had voted for Thomas Jefferson for his first vote, but then gave Thomas Pinckney its second vote. Another kind of strange thing that we might not normally think of. But all these people running for vice president were obviously lost because Thomas Jefferson got elected based on the first vote. Now, in 1797, the other states cast their votes for U.S. House. And what you can see here is that the Federalists had a net gain of 4, which was enough to give them control of the U.S. House of Representatives. One of the things that happened during this period is that 2 terms were used for the first time. John Adams was called the president-elect in the Massachusetts Mercury at the very end of 1796, even though at that point that was not known. And Thomas Jefferson was called the vice president-elect in the Philadelphia Minerva that came out on Inauguration Day, but was published the day before. It was dated March 4, 1797, that covered events up to March 3. So this was the races for U.S. House, obviously, shifting towards the Federalists was a reflection of the fact that by this time in early 1797, it was known that John Adams had been elected. So the joint session of Congress met on February 8 to count the electoral vote, find out who had won. Some things happen here for the first time that are kind of important, which is why I'm going into this little bit of detail that I won't mention later. This is that room. And John Adams, you can see there's like that railing there, and above that, there's like that curved area. So John Adams would be on top of that curved area as Vice President of the United States. He, according to the Constitution, was supposed to preside over this. The assistant chair was the Speaker of the House, Jonathan Dayton. So at this time, a tradition was made where the Senate would appoint one teller of the majority party in the Senate, who was a Federalist. And the U.S. House would appoint two tellers, which were one from each party, which is what they did. And that's been standard since then. So at the beginning, John Adams, as he had done in 1793, oh, that says joint session 1793. That should be 1797. Sorry. He stood up at the beginning. He explained what was happening. He mentioned all the messengers who had been appointed by the states came and had deposited their account of the presidential vote in his office, which was actually down the hall but upstairs in the same building. Each state was also supposed to mail their results separately, and that duplicate from Kentucky never arrived, which nobody ever complained about. They just let it go. So one thing that they did was sort of interesting is John Adams had them to go over the certificates from the states in what was considered to be reverse order. For some reason, throughout the early years of the American Republic, when things like this were being read, like what did New York do, what did Pennsylvania do, at a joint session of Congress and in national conventions, they would usually start in New England and work their way south and then west. For some reason, here they started with Tennessee and worked their way south and then north to New Hampshire. So John Adams at the end of this, was able to declare himself elected president and Thomas Jefferson vice president. That happens from time to time. It seems sort of a conflict of interest or something, but vice presidents sometimes get elected president. Okay, this is going a little bit longer than I thought it was going to. We're close to the end. So Inauguration Day, March 4, 1797. The day before the election, Thomas Jefferson arrived, as you know, with his wagons of stuff because he was moving into Philadelphia and he was not going to live the life that John Adams lived, a very modest life. Thomas Jefferson was going to be the famous rich guy. And Jefferson went over to visit John Adams the day before the inauguration. John Adams was not able to sleep that night, he wrote, which is sort of interesting. So the next day, 10 in the morning, Thomas Jefferson was inaugurated in the U.S. Senate chamber. The senator from Philadelphia, William Bingham, administered the oath of office to Thomas Jefferson, which is sort of interesting that it was a senator who did this and not a judge of some kind. And then Thomas Jefferson gave a short address, which is kind of interesting because vice presidents don't usually give an inaugural address, or haven't usually. So this was the first time that the vice president took the oath of office before the president. That had not happened the two previous times, but this becomes standard after this. So then they organized the new Senate, which would stay for just a few days to approve any potential changes in John Adams's cabinet before they went home, because the Senate had been in session up until this inauguration day. So then at noon, everybody went downstairs to the U.S. House chamber, and this is where John Adams was inaugurated. Interestingly enough, a lot of people were in the House chamber waiting for everybody to come downstairs. So Thomas Jefferson came down from upstairs. Everybody clapped. Here he is. George Washington arrived by carriage. He wasn't there at that time. And the applause was apparently louder for George Washington, which kind of makes sense, than it had been for Thomas Jefferson. So then John Adams, the Supreme Court, the Secretary of State, and foreign ministers came in, and they were seated in kind of an interesting way. This is not something that we always do, but from the perspective of the people who were observing all of this, they saw the Secretary of the Senate, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Jonathan Dayton, who was the Speaker of the House. And then in front of them was the four of the members of the Supreme Court. So John Adams gave his inaugural address, and then Oliver Ellsworth, who was the Chief Justice, administered the oath. So this is the first time the Chief Justice did that. Okay, here's where something interesting happened. Adams, as you know, was exhausted because he hadn't been able to sleep that night, and he wanted to go home. So he left. So then there was a question of, well, what happens now? Because we have all these people here, and we don't need to be here anymore. So somebody said, well, why don't we establish an order of who leaves, like who leaves next? So Thomas Jefferson said that Washington, as the outgoing president, should leave next. And Washington said no. Thomas Jefferson, as the incoming vice president, should be the second to leave. So they had a discussion about this. What do we do? What's the protocol? So they decided from this point forward, the new president leaves first, then the vice president. Any other people who had served as president but are no longer in office would leave. Then the Senate, then the foreign ministers, then the cabinet, and then the U.S. House. Okay, so there was a huge crowd outside because unlike 1789, all this was inside and not a whole lot of people were in there. So the crowd, of course, was cheering every time somebody went out. So then at 4:30, several of these people went to sort of an official meal that George Washington had paid for at a hotel. Then, 2 days later, George Washington called John Adams and Thomas Jefferson to the president's house, which I think I have yes, this is where he lived. This is not there anymore. You can go there today, and this is interpreted. And he wanted to have a discussion with them about sort of getting things off on the right foot since they were political adversaries, which is great that he did this. You'll hear sometimes people say that Washington and Jefferson, after the Adams inauguration, never saw each other again. Well, they did 2 days later, okay? It's sort of a really small thing. Okay, one of the things that the Democratic Republicans did, which the Federalists failed to do, is they were already engaged in a public relations campaign to convince the public not to support the Federalists. And one of the people who was involved in this is this guy, Benjamin F. Bach, who was the grandson of Benjamin Franklin. And so he wrote this in his paper. When a retrospect is taken of the Washington administration for 8 years, this day, when John Adams became president, ought to be a jubilee in the United States, for the man who is the source of all the misfortunes of our country is this day reduced to a level with his fellow citizens. Just a terrible thing to say about George Washington. Very unfair, but in all fairness, it was the Democratic Republicans who were just unfair in their criticism of the other side during these races. Okay, so that's it for the election of 1796. We have John Adams elected president, and Thomas Jefferson, who was not supposed to be elected vice president, becomes vice president, and they get to serve in the third presidential term in American history. So there you have it. I hope you found this interesting, and I'm hoping to have a presentation about the presidential election of 1800 in about a week. Okay, thanks so much.